Hey friends, Kevin Makins, a regular pastor here, and let's talk about Ravi Zacharias, which isn't what I'd like to be talking about right now, but in a story that's become all too familiar, the grand defender of the Christian faith, the man who was known worldwide for shutting down the atheists and arguing against other religions and clarifying why Christianity is true. Well, comes out that there have been years and years and years of sexual and psychological abuse at his hand, money being used to cover up stories, NDAs, multiple phones. It's just a disastrous and horrible message. And since he died back in May, we now are left trying to figure out what to make of this situation and how to make sense of all of this chaos without him being around to be accountable for his actions. Without looking specifically at just this one case, there are many, many times where the same pattern tends to play out when powerful Christian leaders are caught in these sorts of abusive or unethical situations. And so I just want to offer 3 insights that I have as I've watched these play out time and time again, and how we as followers of Jesus and as the church can maybe shift the systems to protect others from this kind of abuse and to make an environment where this kind of abuse is more difficult to hide. And I also want to then end with looking at one lie that Ravi told that absolutely needs to be cast back into the pit of hell. So here we go. Number 1, in wanting to extend grace, Christians have actually cheapened it. Grace is the most powerful force in the universe. It can take somebody who has nothing to offer, is at the bottom of the barrel, the end of their rope. They have no strength left, no power left. They simply have to fall on grace and mercy. And then grace offers unconditional acceptance, embrace, love, community, all of it unmerited. But to receive that kind of grace, we have to give up on our power games. We have to give up our control. We have to give up our image and our ego in order to receive that sort of gift. And that is not what we're dealing with in this situation. When the story first came out, it was all framed as inappropriate texting. And I thought, maybe Ravi's just human, and if he could just own these failures, maybe it would make space for grace to break into his life and lives of others around him. But now we know this was not a single instance or a struggle at all. This was someone entering into continual abuse, who used women's own trauma in the past and his own spiritual language to use and abuse dozens of people, playing multiple games to hide things, cover up, control the narrative and situation. And so the response to a lot of this has been, at least from the corners of the internet I've looked at, people saying, well, we're all sinners. No one's perfect. He is now forgiven in God's presence. And while the timing of this is off, the theology is off as well. Because all of us sin, but not all of us sin in the same way, and not all sin causes the same amount of harm. You can roll a stop sign or run over a person. Both are sins in your car, but they have completely different levels of impact. What we are dealing with Ravi Zacharias was not someone who was struggling with abuse, but someone who continued to cover up, to play games in order to continue his abuse. And the fallout from it is huge, first and foremost on the victims, but also on all who put their trust in his message and in who he was. Does that mean that someone like Ravi, a serial sexual abuser, is beyond grace in like an eternal sense? I don't know. But we don't have confession or a hint of remorse. We have cover-ups and multiple cell phones and NDAs and throwing money and power around and threats. And that, what we at least can see, is someone who is closed off to grace and working in his own power, no matter what language he used on stage. So I would suggest that now is not the time to spin the situation or try to look for the positives. Now is the time to name what he did as wrong, as sinful, as abusive, to grieve it together, and to recommit ourselves to making an atmosphere where grace is always available when we hit our limits, so that we don't need to manage our shadows anymore. We can step out into the light knowing that there is abundant grace when we come open-handed, weak, and vulnerable. Number 2, how we believe is just as, if not more important than what we believe. Jesus said you would know his disciples by their fruit, but that is difficult work. To see the fruit of someone's life, you've got to spend time with them, have a relationship with them, ask them questions, listen to them talk. You've got to get in so deep to see the fruit. And maybe Christians and Christian institutions just decided that that was too much work. And so we shifted from looking at how people live their lives to fixating on what they say they believe. And when it comes to someone who believes the truth and argues for what is orthodox and correct and wins the battle, well, you couldn't ask for a better example than Ravi Zacharias. It was his job to win every argument and to speak for us. I suspect that for a lot of people, watching Ravi enter into a debate with that confident atheist gave them a certain level of confidence in their own beliefs. Maybe the viewer couldn't go toe-to-toe with the atheist or the person of the other religion at the water cooler at work, but Ravi did it on a stage, and he won, and he is correct. Therefore, I can feel correct. Therefore, I win, and therefore, I can feel confident in my religious beliefs. But we shouldn't forget that Jesus never told us to win arguments. Jesus wasn't really into debate. He told us to live lives that bear the kind of fruit that the world around us will see as good, to live lives of forgiveness, of mercy, of compassion. And he often suggested that what we do is actually more important than what we claim to believe. This is the shadow side of Christian apologetics, defending the Christian faith. That we can spend so much time trying to convince others of how correct we are that we don't actually become reshaped and reformed into the image of Christ. Our greatest apologetic is not our ability to win a fight or a debate. Everybody's trying to do that. It's actually the opposite. It is when we are weak, when we are humble, when we do not feel the need to fight for our God because we trust that he can handle it himself. It is in those moments that we witness to a faith that is truly good news. Finally, our current Christian leadership model is fundamentally broken. Obviously, those who most deserve our care and affection and sympathy in this situation are the victims themselves. So that has to be where we focus. And once we've done that, we can begin to back up and ask bigger questions like, what is it about the way that Christians view leadership that keeps producing this kind of bad fruit? There's a story in 1 Samuel about when the nation of Israel asked God for a king. They finally established the land and they want a ruler like all the other rulers. And the prophet Samuel warns them. It's funny looking back on these biblical stories because I feel like we often say, well, if we were back then, we wouldn't ask for a king like all those other nations. No, we would just trust God. But of course we wouldn't. We would ask for a king just like they did, and we know it because we've done it. In Western culture, we don't really have kings and queens anymore. That's not how most of the world works. But we do have celebrities. And sometimes I feel like Christians have looked around at all the influential voices, the powerful men and women that are in the culture around us and said, well, what we really need are versions of that in the church. We want Christian celebrities to speak for us, to share tweets that we can retweet, to make us look good, to stand up for our issues and our causes. And boy, did we get them. And just like Israel demanding a king, we are now reaping what we, the church, have sown. My guess is that leadership is going to be shifting from the single superman or superwoman who speaks up for the whole faith to a new model of community-led ownership, which is team-based, mutual in submission, that puts margins at the center, that values faithfulness over success, and that moves as slow as the speed of relationships. This is worth considering with the rise of Christian podcasting and YouTubing, that anyone who watches this content or creates this content is going to have to really do so with a great deal of intention, or else we're just going to repeat, that's the same thing. We're just going to repeat the mistakes of the past. However, If we can make these shifts to do this sort of work in healthy and rooted ways, we will end up creating communities where perpetrators like Ravi are unable to hide their abuse. And we're also going to make the kind of communities that are more likely to produce healthy people who can deal with those shadows and integrate their life in such a way that they don't feel the need to perform harm or abuse, because they'll be known and named and loved within a real flesh and blood community. Finally, to the lie that I heard as this all started coming out, that I just want to cast back into the pit of hell. Apparently Ravi said to one of the women that if she were to speak against him, she would be responsible for the millions of souls whose salvation would be lost if his reputation was damaged. And that is a lie. Because no one can say that without at some level thinking that they are responsible for the salvation of millions of souls. But in speaking the truth and damaging his reputation, you, those who speak out in these sorts of situations, you are actually reclaiming the power of the gospel. It reminds us that the power of God is not in winning arguments, building organizations, or expanding influence, but actually in the opposite. That God's work has always been on the underside, in the quiet places, and among those who do not get celebrated at those largest levels, but faithfully serve in small and simple ways. You have not damaged the integrity of the gospel. You have helped us see it even more clearly. We now have yet another chance to learn from our failure, to repent of it, and to place ourselves into the hands of a God who we can trust. Grace and peace, guys. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with hopefully something a little more upbeat. Stay strong out there. Bye.